Hey everyone, I want to welcome you to part 3 of our series of conversations called The Great Awokening. And I'm here once again with my co-host from All the Things, Moinque Duson.
You know, I didn't even introduce you on the last one. I was just like, hey, this is what we're talking about, folks. Let's jump right in.
That's right. Well, I just like to get people oriented to what we're doing and talking about helping people start at the very beginning of critical race theory. What is it? And walking people through the ABCs of what this is, how to recognize it, and how does it compare and contrast with the Christian worldview. Now, in this episode, we're going to start diving a little bit into the key beliefs of critical race theory. We've been alluding to them in the previous two conversations, but now we're going to dive a little bit deeper into what is a sort of a summary of the framework.
Yes.
So let's start at the beginning here and talk about whites creating a caste system, because that is really the foundation of so many critical ideas.
Yes. So when we think about critical theory, remembering that it was the peering into unjust systems and looking at the social inequalities within communities and societies and things like that. So one of the key beliefs is that whites created a caste system based on skin color, darker skin being evil or at the bottom of the feeding chain, and white skin or the lighter skin being the better race.
And we see this sometimes even playing out in the past, where there was this idea that racial intermixing, sometimes white slave owners would have children with black women, and then the children that would be born out of that would be mixed race. And some of them could be able to, what they call pass white. Mm-hmm. And they were able to pass as white people and go into society and have a level of acceptance. But you might have a sibling who has darker skin, and they would not be able to integrate as well into society. And so I think it's something that a lot of white people have never really thought about before. We aren't aware of it, but in the Black community, it's a conversation.
Yeah, it is a conversation within the Black community, but in every group of people that I have ever had encounter with, like deep encounter, relational encounter with, in any of my travels around the world, this is something that comes up. And so I think there is fairness in saying that looking at why people behave this way, that's okay. But adopting this as saying whites believe, all white people believe that because their skin is lighter, they are better.
They're better.
That's an error.
Yeah, that's a different situation.
Yeah.
That's, though, really a foundational idea that you hear a lot of advocates of critical race theory talking about. And there's a lot of ideas that are built on that foundation.
Yeah. Now, one of the things, though, that I do want to highlight is that race is a very social construct. When you look at the biology of humans and our biological differences, there's very little difference between humans, white, Black, or otherwise. Race was created to keep some people down and to elevate others. Does that intrinsically mean, though, that the heart of every white person is to do that? No. And that's where we need to be able to thread these frameworks out and not bring them into the church, because then we're saying that no matter how many times you have gotten your heart clean with the Lord because you wear this skin, this is just the condition of your heart.
Yeah.
Until you become woke.
I think there's a couple of points I want to make there, because when people will hear CRT advocates use this phraseology of race as a social construct, it took me the longest time to understand what they were even saying. So I want to just make it really clear what we are saying with that. So genetically, scientifically, we are saying there is
the human race.
There is one race.
Yes.
The human race. There's literally like no difference between you and I genetically. We're both Homo sapiens sapiens. That is our species. And when we boil down the genetics, we look at it and the differences are negligible. There is one human race, and that is it. And that comports well with Scripture, which is something we'll get to in another episode, that from God's perspective, there's just one race. There's the human race. But when CRT people say that race is a social construct, what I thought they were saying for a long time is that the color of melanin difference in our skin is a social construct. And I'm like, no, it's not. That's an objective reality. I have less, you have more. Mm-hmm. And it was highly confusing to me, like what that phraseology meant. I think what it means is that dividing people according to race and assigning more value, less value is a social construct. That is something that we as humans put on top of each other.
Yes, I like to say that race is made up.
But race is not made up in that people look at us because you don't like it when people use the phraseology of colorblind.
Yes,
so it's confusing.
What I am saying is that it was made up for the benefit of. When we say that it's a social construct, that the idea of Black being less and white being more or better is not something that's real or true. It's something that
the value system
made up.
The value system of race value is a social construct.
Yes.
But race itself, the observation, the visual observation
is real. Yes. And I am not white.
Yeah. But this is a very nuanced position, and it's highly confusing when you're just getting into the discussion. So genetically, scientifically, we're saying there's no difference between us.
Yes.
We're saying on the outer appearance, you have more melanin than I do. And that's just an observation. But the idea of attaching value to that melanin is a social construct.
Yes.
That's what we're talking about.
Yes. And it is just
it only took me 15 months to get there.
Well, look at you. I'm very proud of you. But I think this idea just shows the core of the human heart. The fact that there is sin, and sin is real, and people are messy and sinful, and we do things out of fear. We do things out of a sinful heart, and just the fact that we are fallen.
Okay.
And that's important to understand, that these ideas and value systems came about because we live in a fallen world. And the same way that someone would say, oh, white people think that their skin is better or of more importance because they're white than, someone of color. I know within the Black community, we'll do the same thing. I see somebody who may be darker than me or lighter than me, and there's conversation even within me, in coming out of that way of thinking and having been raised, and so I know, like, even as children, even as adults, we'll have different conversations among each other.
So it's not just a white-Black thing. It's even within the Black community, there's conversations about shades of
melanin. Yeah. About which girl will this guy go for, the darker skin one or the lighter skin one? There's so many pieces to it, but what I see is that Blacks or people of color, because I do think that it is not just within the Black community, but we want to demonize whites for upholding this view that Black skin is bad. And it's really not even a view. It's just an assumption that we now put on people with white skin and say, well, they think that they don't like Black skin, or they think they're better than Blacks. And, well, I haven't had a conversation with you yet. You might not have held the door because you didn't see me, or,
something else.
Yeah. Maybe 1,000 things were on your mind. But I don't know.
Those are some good thoughts. All right, let's go on to the second point here, and that is that racism was embedded in American culture from the beginning. American society, government, and religion were intended to exclude people of color or divest them of equal rights, and continues to pervade every aspect of American culture. And I think that statement at the end is of particular importance, because I think that we could agree
history is ugly.
History is hard our history as Americans is very beautiful and very tragic. It is very noble and very evil. And
we can't get around that.
Yeah. It just is what it is.
Yeah.
Let's call a thing. And I think that white people would do well to learn more of the Black experience, more Black history, not just on Black History Day or whatever, but to really
February. Month.
Okay. Sorry. Not trying to rip you off or nothing.
I appreciate that.
So I think that it's important for us to be educated about that.
Yeah.
But the critical part of the CRT model is that racism continues to pervade the culture today. And that would be a highly confusing point, I think, for many people.
Yeah.
But that is the assertion of critical race theory.
That is the assertion. And that doesn't mean that we don't have work to do in America. Like, that doesn't mean that
we're still sinful.
Yeah, that we're not sinful, or that, we live in some non-racist utopia.
Yeah.
That's not true. And we are also not at the place where we were, and a lot of strides have been made to eradicate issues regarding race. And so to say that everything is exactly the same, we have to decolonize, because we're still living in a very colonized time period. And that same thought is what pervades the American fabric. I don't agree with.
That might be a bit of an overstatement, or it might be a little bit too far. So, but that is part of the CRT angle.
Yeah. Is
that we still are, wherever there is a majority of white people, there are racist systems that need to be smashed.
Yes.
And that still pervades nearly every sector of life. Yeah. And that is the great woke enterprise,
yes,
if you will.
You have to become woke to understanding that.
Yeah.
This one we talked about in our last segment. Racism isn't merely individual acts. It refers to large-scale systems in society called systemic racism that produce racist outcomes.
So again, I think that most white people are familiar with racism as just being an individual thing. And so their immediate reaction is, well, I'm not a racist. I've never burned a cross on anyone's lawn. I don't belong to the KKK.
I don't care if you drink out of this water fountain.
Yeah, I don't, we share bathrooms, they're like, I don't understand why CRT advocates are saying that there's still racism and it's so pervasive everywhere. I can't see it. Mm-hmm. It's because they're not aware of the systems.
Yes. Things that don't lend to certain people groups.
It's almost like invisible racism.
Mm-hmm. And that's why they call it the system, because now it doesn't need the individual. Like, it doesn't need you to stand out with a flag or a cross or a sign. Now what happens is lenders won't lend to certain groups, or people won't necessarily rent or sell homes to certain people and things like that. So then it becomes more of a system, this way that business is conducted.
Or questions about whether sentencing is fair in the prison system.
Yeah.
Do people of color receive the same types of sentences for the same crimes as white people? Mm-hmm. And I think that these are all important questions to ask, explore, be curious about. But at the same time, there's a lot of really complicated issues involved in each and every one to unpack.
And every system is not a racist system.
Not every inequality or inequity is necessarily for a racist reason.
Yes. Yeah.
There's all manner of disparities for any number of reasons.
Yes.
And so we have to be curious about that. But you'll often hear people who advocate for CRT talking about racist systems.
Yes, that everything should be equal and equality. And, I'm all for justice and good, the good measure, that we wouldn't treat someone with partiality. But one of the things we've been talking about lately is disparities. And is God okay with disparities? And I'm hoping that we actually carry that on at the end of this video to really, or at the end of all of our segments, because I think talking about disparities and looking at how there are disparities in society,
Yeah.
and what is God okay with in disparities? Is there anything that He's okay with when it comes to the idea of disparity?
Right. Yeah, it's a good issues. Okay, finally, on this slide is that whites lack the ability to see their participation in racism unless they train themselves to see the world through a CRT lens. And we call this woke. This is what it means to be woke, which reveals the various forms of racism that continue to oppress people of color. And, you know, there's a lot of conversation happening around this issue in a lot of churches right now, that whites don't see their participation in racism. And until you adopt this framework of being woke, you can't see it. And so you need this lens so that you can begin to be less racist. And this is a hard issue, but you'll hear people talk this way quite a lot.
The next one, racism is a means by which society allocates privilege and status to whites. So going from the individual now doing their individual acts, it's the way in which society kind of allocates this privilege.
White privilege is a term
privilege,
that
yes.
people might hear
Yeah.
along these lines, that there's just certain privileges that I, as a white person, am not aware of, that I receive. I call them sort of the benefit of the doubt privileges, you know, that am I going to get pulled over by a policeman? You know, am I more likely or less likely? Am I more likely to get shot? Am I less likely to get shot by law enforcement? I mean, these are sorts of issues and questions that come up around this issue.
The next one runs right into it, that white supremacy is maintained through appeals to supposedly neutral, objective values and principles such as forgiveness, color blindness, and meritocracy. So the hug that was felt around the world, we did a All the Things episode about the guy, and he was
forgiving his brother's killer.
Murderer, yes.
Yeah, and he asked her for a hug at the sentencing hearing, and boy, that broke the internet because people of color said, you know, they took exception to this because they feel like there's been an insistence on them, a burden that's put on them of forgiveness about racial prejudice and racist acts that have been committed against them. And they're like, it's enough forgiveness already. Mm-hmm. We're not forgiving anyone else.
Yes.
And that is something that sometimes you hear people talk about that advocate for CRT.
And I don't think that is necessarily without warrant. Like when you look back over history, like we've said, we don't want to negate history, that if something was done to a Black person and it was done by a white person, there would be this exchange where the Black person needs to forgive, needs to say, I'm sorry, you know, no worries about it. And you get on your merry way quickly. And one, I don't believe that that's our framework today. I don't believe that that's where we sit as a society today completely.
Where white people are just insisting to Black people, hey boy, you apologize.
Yes.
You make it right. You apologize to the woman. And this is the mindset that's
still there, and it's still in every part of our society.
Yeah.
And then two, even if it were, as Christians, we are commanded to forgive. As Christians, we are commanded. How many times should I forgive him?
Yeah.
You know, and the Lord gives us this astronomical number. Well, it feels astronomical to me, you know, in which we're supposed to forgive. We're supposed to have radical forgiveness. And so where I hear CRT advocates talking about Black forgiveness and how Black forgiveness is costly and we should not just expend our Black forgiveness and give it away so freely, I disagree. I think that forgiveness is our command
Yeah.
as we love and as we move forward in Jesus. So,
there's a lot to unpack there. I think, this other issue about color blindness and meritocracy, these are now looked upon as being white ideas. The idea of, well, I don't, you'll hear white people say a lot of times, like, I don't see color.
And I say, shame. Can you see this?
But you and I have had a lot of discussions about what that phraseology means and what white people think it means and what people of color, how they experience it and interpret it. But this is looked upon as being another way of enforcing white supremacy.
Yes.
You're not seeing my true self. My true self is that I have, this melanin in my skin and that this is who I am. And so to not see my color is to not see me. And that is a form of white supremacy. I don't think that's actually what white people mean when they say that phrase, but we'll save that conversation.
And that took me a long time to understand. I was like, what? What?
But we'll save that discussion for another video.
The first thing you see, I'm 5'9", people.
Yeah. So, all right. All white people benefit from whiteness, large scale cultural systems. We've kind of covered that as part of white privilege. CRT seeks to decenter whiteness. It offers an alternative framework that gives voice to the marginalized and the silenced. And so again, this is the idea of you go into a space, you have a white professor, predominantly white students in the classroom. The assumption is you're going to be learning white history or white theology, and that's how it's going to go. And the question is where's my narrative? Where's my truth as a person of color? How do we decenter the whiteness and put forth this alternative framework? So let's look at this next one here and this is an interesting one to me, is white-run power structures will only tolerate or encourage the advances of people of color when they also promote white self-interest.
Yes.
This was quite a revelation for me to understand what was being said here, and that the CRT framework will assert that I am only interested in advancing you on my platforms because I can get you to agree with me. And so I'm willing to put you in front and advance you, but only because you agree with me.
Or because there's benefit for you in the larger society.
Yeah.
So
I'm still really oppressing you.
Yes. So let's take this conversation here. The only reason you may choose under this, and I want to make sure that I'm saying this clearly, under the critical race theory umbrella or that framework, Krista would only be having this conversation with me publicly, especially, is because you believe that having a Black person having this conversation with you will promote you in the greater society. So you're always looking, even subconsciously, for your own benefit. You would just be using me as a mouthpiece. And I'll just go ahead and put that on record. That is not the case.
Monique is a very independent thinker.
That is true.
And she has her own thoughts.
And we do what I want, and we usually. Or what Jesus tells me to do.
We don't agree on everything. But I think that maybe another example of this is that some people in the Black community would say, well, in a white-dominated church, they're only going to bring a Black person on staff at the church who agrees with their white methodologies or their white theology. And they're not going to bring somebody on.
They wouldn't bring me on because I sure don't be going for that. You know, it's like, well, don't we all love Jesus? Yeah. So
they're looking for a Black person who acts and thinks white.
Yes.
And so if a Black person wants to advance in the world, they need to act and think white. And then the white people will advance them. And again, this is all in the mindset of CRT advocates.
There's actually a term called code switching.
Oh, this is new for me.
Yes. And I don't know if we'll actually put this in or not, so y'all might be surprised. But code switching is when a Black person or any person of color who may use a certain dialect or rhythm in their speaking moves to speak a more proper enunciation and dialect, they talk white. Yes. Code switching. And I can't believe I've never told you that.
No. So is that kind of looked down upon in the Black community, somebody who code switches?
Yes and no. So I was just on this whole thing on Facebook a couple of days ago about, which is why it reminded me of the term, is because Black people know, like, if I show up to work and I'm just like, y'all know what? Not today. Let me go and let you know real quick. Hello? Like, I just answer. That might be how I speak at home, but in the larger society, that's not what's accepted. And especially if I feel like we think that, especially if we go and work for someone who's white, if we have a white boss, we especially need to put on this air of white talk. But in reality, if you work for me, and like, my first thing I do when I bring an intern on is, you need to get on the phone. I need to know how you talk, because I need to understand how you are going to speak to my clients. I'm not going to have you using slang and talking crazy to them, and they're my client. You know what I mean? So I don't know that it is just
a race issue.
A race issue.
Or a cultural issue.
Yeah, but I'm not gonna lie. I'm not trying to put all Black people business out there either. But when we with ourselves, we relax. We just gonna go and put it out there and be like, hey, you know. I also just think that part of it is just a professional demeanor, and I don't know that has to be white. Yeah. Why does professionalism have to be white?
Well, then what doesn't that sort of demean the Black community?
Yes, I can't be professional.
Yeah.
You know? Now, I can be hood. I do know that. But at the same time, does that mean that hood belongs to Blacks or hood belongs to people of color? See, we don't always thread these things all the way through to understand what we're saying. It's like, oh, I have to code switch. Oh, I have to become white. Oh, I have to become proper, AKA proper only belongs to white and Black is improper. Can we talk about this a little bit? You know, I'm not sure that people are really thinking it all the way through, but those are not things that should be deemed or dubbed white.
Yeah, that's a good word.
And then eradicating racism cannot be accomplished without also paying attention to sexism, homophobia, economic exploitation, and other forms of oppression and injustice. And this is what I was saying in our last segment, is that critical theory is part of a larger project. Actually, it is the parent to many other projects. So you have feminist theory, queer theory, critical race theory, intersectionality. These are all linked together. And if we can go to that next slide, you'll see that it's like a train. And critical theory is the engine. And behind critical theory, you have critical race theory, feminist theory, queer theory. They're all linked together. Other theories are coming along.
Yeah.
Yes, but you can't take feminist theory and remove it, or queer theory and remove it. They're linked together. So wherever critical race theory goes, here comes the other two behind it. I can't be a proponent of critical race theory and yet say that I abhor feminist theory.
Yeah. I think this is a really important point to make about those coming into the church, because,
yes,
you know, there's a lot of evangelical, conservative, on paper still, colleges, Christian colleges and churches that will say, well, we're just trying to engage in a project of racial reconciliation,
inclusivity,
and be inclusive and diverse and justice oriented, but they just want to look at critical race theory ideas. But they don't, I don't know if they're not aware or they just don't see it, but right on their tail is coming, then the women are saying, yeah, but what about us? Mm-hmm. We're also oppressed. We also need diversity. We also need a platform. We also want to smash the patriarchy. And then the LGBT community says, well, we're also oppressed. Where's our voice for diversity? How come we're not on the platform? And then you get, you know, fat theory and ableist theory. And part of all of this is that you and I as Christians are are part of an oppressor class. You know, we are called religious normativity.
Yes.
And because we have the majority position, and the oppressed classes would be people from other religions. And so there would be a sense of where those people are like, well, where's our platform? How do we decenter Christianity?
Yes. And that's where this is leading.
Yeah.
How do we decenter patriarchy? How do we decenter Christianity? Like, this is where this is leading, and people aren't understanding the larger idea.
Well, that's a great place to just sort of land this conversation. And when we come back next time in part 4, we're going to talk a little bit about critical race theory as a worldview, because I think it has some very critical features. It shares them with a worldview, and I think it's functioning as a worldview for many people in their teens and 20s.
Yeah.
So we'll pick it up there next time. Thanks for watching.